I'm just interested to know whether you found that people took proper heed of the tags that you put on buildings, or whether you had problems with people either still being wary of buildings that you said were safe, or vice versa. Of yeah, either way.
Yeah, so that's a very good question. There were many issues actually with the misuse of tags. I can give you some examples. For instance, there were some people who had properties that they actually wanted to get rid of, and they found out that the government was going to take care of demolition work for the structures that were damaged. So they would literally go around trying to remove red tags from buildings that had been severely damaged and placing them on their own building in hopes that they would be demolished. There were similar issues in some areas where the property or the value of the land was really high, and there were historical buildings that you wouldn't be allowed to theoretically demolish. And some people, I guess, with some influence, kind of took a similar approach. And I did some evaluations actually with architects that were responsible and aware of some of these existing buildings, and they were pretty devastated to see that people took advantage of a situation like this for their own benefit. So it is a problem, but at the end of the day, I guess your responsibility ends at a certain point. So you do the assessment, you create a report, you put the tag, and then what's important, I guess, is that the municipality has a record of what you've done, and you sort of leave it there, and there is a record of the assessment. But there's not much you can do. In fact, it is recommended that you don't try and sort of engage and convince someone that they shouldn't be removing or doing that kind of thing with the tags. So yeah.
Question for Carlos as well. It's fairly related. What's the liability of the team when you give these tags? So if you give a green tag and then something happens in the building, what happens in this case?
Yeah, so I think that's also a very good question. So part of the reason why we wanted to have local engineers alongside the international engineers in the assessments that we did, in addition to doing knowledge transfer, was also to make sure that the ultimate call was done by one of the locals. So we would provide advice on what we thought the end result of the assessment should be, but ultimately that was sort of tagged or affiliated back to the local engineer from the municipality who was doing the work with us.
How do you find dealing with language barriers in Nepal or in Ecuador?
Yeah, sure. So in Nepal, it wasn't too much of an issue in that our driver. So it was a very kind of informal arrangement. But if there's a language barrier, then you'd obviously need someone with you who can translate, ideally. And I think that's always been the case. It's whatever's available, but you would need some kind of translator. So anytime we were out, we had someone who could mediate. After the disaster, I was involved in tagging buildings as well, and again we had. There was always someone there who could mediate, but I think without the mediation, it would certainly be difficult. But I think in previous disasters, for example, when the team deployed to Pakistan in 2005, I think there were instances there where obviously they weren't able to communicate directly at times. But I think the nature of the job, it's pretty obvious what we're there to do. So it's perhaps less of an issue than having to communicate with a building owner. About the meaning of what a tagging might be. So what did you find?
So in my case in Ecuador, I speak Spanish, so that was not a problem. But I guess I would highlight that there were some teams that were deployed on bilateral agreements. They didn't have Spanish speakers, and they didn't engage or seek out a translator. And for a little while, actually, that sort of hindered the response effort. So I think for teams that are deploying, it's important to be self-sufficient, not just in terms of taking care of themselves, but also thinking of how are they going to interact and get their work done. So ultimately, that was resolved by finding someone who spoke the other language and could then liaise. But I think it could be a barrier, and it's something that needs to be thought about upfront.
Yeah, it was also, just to throw in, it was quite interesting to work in the UCC, the USAR coordination cell, this a tent where all of the USAR coordination happens. And so obviously there's lots of languages coming in from the different teams there, and it's the working language is technically meant to be English, but there was definitely times where we're trying to register in teams, etc., that are arriving, and having to dig out my pretty rubbish Spanish and so on and so forth. But generally, among the teams, it's generally English, and then we do, as you say, it's very important to be completely self-sufficient. So we'll always make every effort to have a translator with us.
I guess, especially looking at the longer term and how you prevent. There's always probably a key question in some of these disasters that comes up, the design. You mentioned a lot about communities, which I thought was very interesting, that the desire to have, that I want to reinforce concrete structure, yet the detailing is done so badly that actually it causes bigger issues than actually the promotion of vernacular structures within areas, especially in South America, the bamboo structures, you mentioned the timber. I guess it's just, what is your thought on that dialogue and how sometimes in these communities, certainly as you look in responses in other parts where you would try to put that forwards, but they're insistent, even the local authorities, engineers, no, we want to go with a concrete structure, yet the detailing doesn't exist. And where do we see that? Where do you feel that maybe engagement or needs to improve? How do you engage the community on that? Or actually, is that the right approach?
Well, it's interesting because in Nepal, different communities actually had different responses. Some of them were, especially these remote communities, were saying, we don't want anything in rubble stone. We've seen the devastation of this, and we'd rather have really lightweight structures, actually, that might have other problems in day-to-day life. In terms of this desire, as you say, for this modern material, sometimes there can be compromises. So, for example, I worked on a school in Afghanistan, which was at a larger scale, but where they originally wanted a concrete moment frame, which is very, very challenging to design, to build, all the ductile detailing, all the rebar. And so I worked with the local engineers and said, what do you need? They said, we need something durable. That's why we have these unreinforced masonry walls in this moment frame building. And we came up with a solution to do the school in reinforced hollow block masonry. So the structural walls became the walls, and they were durable, but it was much, much easier to build than a highly ductile concrete moment frame. And they were so happy with the result in construction that they ended up, this was for the UN, they ended up applying the same construction methods for 13 other schools in Afghanistan. And this was new to them. This was a new type of building, but it was an urban environment. They could get this material. It wasn't too expensive. I think it's more challenging when you're in a place where the materials are so limited, like in Nepal, in some of the rural areas. So then it might be a matter of adapting some of the materials and the techniques they have and making them better. And I don't know if you're familiar with Build Change, this organization Elizabeth Hausler leads, but I think they often take this approach that there are often small modifications that can be made to existing construction or choices that can be made that will make a big difference in the seismic safety. But it is a case by case thing. You can't generalize. I don't know if that answers your question.
Can I throw in on that as well? I think that's all completely true. The community engagement, or the parallel top-down, bottom-up approach seems to be what's really important, because you've alluded to the fact that codes aren't necessarily followed, and then you've also alluded to the fact that people might not actually want what are the technical correct solutions. And there's good examples. There's really good build change case studies from Nepal and Haiti. There's actually a good Radar video from Tom Newby talking about a case study in Pakistan. And where that one's really important is that obviously a disaster it has to be turned into an opportunity to build back safer, because disasters are one of the few periods of time when people actually, their attention is focused on building more safely, because the rest of the time, and very shortly after a disaster, people's needs turn necessarily back to water, schooling, housing, and so on and so forth. So those transitional shelter projects, like the one in Pakistan from the other RedTalk, is an opportunity where the government actually led a reconstruction program, training locals to train others in a kind of cascade model with community engagement and so on and so forth included. So using those transitional shelter opportunities seems to be one of the few times when you really can have a bit of malleability in what people's opinions are as to what's safe construction. So yeah, I'm a big fan of capacity building from the bottom up, like the NSET projects as well.
This question's for Josh. It's just about, so you turn up to a damaged building and you assess the safest entry by looking at it. Then how much risk do you take? How close do you get in deciding whether you can go in and try and save people or not, just by looking at it?
So how much risk do I take as an engineer, or me personally?
Yeah, or just deciding someone should go in there and see if someone's there.
Yeah, okay. So that was probably my main concern when joining the organisation. Because it's quite a thing to put people at risk like that. Within our particular organisation, SARAID, we're very fluid in terms of what you're willing to do. So if, as an engineer, your primary role is an external one, to stand and have an overview of the situation, see the building, see if it's moving, see if it's changing, and so on and so forth, and then make those calls. But in reality, all of the engineers in the team are just members of the team. So that means that we're willing to be going into buildings and so on and so forth. I mean, obviously, for example, the door that I showed you inside the building, you wouldn't see that from outside. So as a member of the team, you're able to be that external person if you want, but to be really effective, then you have to get involved the same as anyone else, and that means digging, crawling, and so on and so forth. But the final call of who goes into that building isn't the engineers; it's the team leaders. So at SARAID, we've got, we're very fortunate to have very experienced team leaders with many years of emergency response on the emergency services in the UK and elsewhere as well. And it's really their call, and we're just saying, okay, I think this is the best way to do it. But yeah, it's not a nice feeling when you've made a decision and someone's kind of at risk because of it. You kind of want to share in that risk a bit.
Catherine, you mentioned about problems in countries where people don't often experience earthquakes and therefore they don't fear them. And then Josh, you just also mentioned how people's priorities quickly change after an event. I don't know if this might not be a question you can answer, but can any of you suggest what that kind of time frame is that you've got for people, whether people really are still thinking about the risk, and how quickly people start just to forget and go back to normal life? That might be an impossible question to answer.
Well, it's I guess, I'm from a place where it was totally normal to think about earthquake risk all the time. You don't put anything heavy on a shelf, it's going to fall on you. You have emergency supplies. But then you go north to Oregon and Washington, which have a significant seismic risk, and almost nothing has been done in the way that it's been done in California, because the earthquake, it's a subduction, it's different, it's a different type of tectonic activity, it's very rare. So I don't know in terms of how long do people remember, but people there are becoming aware of the risk, and they are demanding that things be done. So it's not that an event has happened, but it's been communicated to them. They are parents are lobbying for their schools to be fixed, and people are becoming aware of tsunami risk in Washington State and so forth. So it's actually maybe in this age where there's more communication, there's more, we hear about these things more. There actually, that has a benefit in terms of people. If something does happen, the information is available and it remains available. I think it really depends also on the scale of the devastation. So in Japan with the tsunami, or in Indonesia with the tsunami, I don't know, because I haven't spoken to people there, but I can imagine that 20, 30 years later, this is going to be an enormous event for people, and it had enormous consequences that they are not going to forget about. But I don't know if you guys have any personal.
I guess
experience.
I would say I lived in California for a few years too, and I think even though people who want to become informed can become informed, a lot of people, if it hasn't happened in their lifetime, just don't care about it. And I've had plenty of roommates who have very heavy objects in and I did training, neighborhood emergency response team training and things like that to sort of help inform. And literally they didn't care because they didn't think it was going to be an issue for them. So I think, especially with a lot of migration too, and people moving, say, to the Bay Area and other things, it's really hard to sort of make sure that everyone is informed. I think the idea was maybe if you go to a place like Chile, where they have small tremors all the time and they're just second nature to them, but that sort of, it always has you thinking, and you're aware that it's something that you really need to keep in mind. So if you have some sort of gentle reminder every few weeks, then it's definitely something that's going to really be in people's minds, whereas if it's every 20 years, then unless you really want to get out there and find out information and take action, it's a lot harder, I guess, to have it present.
Yeah, I'd say that it basically comes down to how pressing the other needs are. So obviously in places like Nepal and the Philippines, we went to the Philippines, I think it was about a month or two after the Typhoon Haiyan, and there people were rebuilding. But they were rebuilding in ways that were clearly hugely susceptible as the buildings that have just been destroyed to the next hurricane season, and that was out of necessity. So it's a case of when speaking to them, they just say, "Well, no one's told us how we can do it any better," and basically their other needs are more pressing. Then there's not much they feel that they can do about it. But another example is Japan at the other end of the spectrum with the Japan tsunami. We went there twice. If you look up the Earthquake Engineering Field Investigation Team, and they've got reports for Japan soon after the 2011 tsunami, and then 2 years later. Soon after, when we went there and people were still in the emergency shelters and so on and so forth, sleeping in school halls, and the mentality was very much, how can this happen? We're a developed nation. We need to build seawalls. We need to stop this happening straight away. And that is what happened. You got seawalls that are being built around those portions of northeast Japan. But 3 years or 2 years later, the mentality had changed slightly, in that, okay, people wanted to be safer, but then they also want to get back to normal life, because people move to the seaside because they want to see the sea, and they realize they don't actually want a big wall there. So even in Japan, people want to be safe, but within a 2-year period, people want to live their lives and get back to it. And in the Philippines, there's not really much choice, and in Nepal as well. I was under the impression that people are probably going to be building back very similar to how they was there before. But that's why I think those community-led bottom-up approaches, such as the NSAT examples, are really key, because what some of those approaches do is, you mentioned detailing. A lot of the detailing, I'm talking about masonry and simple construction and confined masonry, etc., isn't actually that much more expensive. So teaching very simple things to the actual masons and builders themselves, things like how shear links actually need to be links, because a lot of the time you see links only not connecting in the corners, so they're basically just they're not links at all, they just open up. Where you need more links and where you need less, nothing too specific or involving calculation, but simple stuff. Masonry walls, what is the maximum distance you would allow between buttresses and stuff like that. Those are simple lessons that don't add cost. And while in Nepal, obviously people have other needs that come about, seismic damage is always visible in Nepal. If you walk around Kathmandu before this earthquake, you'll see conjugate shear cracks on walls. You'll see out-of-plane failures of walls and such. And these are there for decades. So people understand that there is a risk. They might not necessarily know what to do about it or not be able to afford the solutions. But those bottom-up approaches showing that there are cheap and appropriate solutions, I think, are really key.
Anyway, I'd like to thank you on behalf of everyone, and maybe we just give them a round of applause. Thank you.